Hello, welcome to another episode of Field of Screams Podcast. Today we'll be covering Halloween 6. Now in my review here, I do want to start on some positives. One thing I can say for Halloween 6, just like Halloween 4 and 5, it definitely does have the Halloween atmosphere. I mean, whenever you're going to see a Halloween movie, that is something you always look to, you hope it has. And this movie does a pretty good job keeping that in place. Another thing I will say, along with the Halloween atmosphere, it does provide some cool lighting and shots. The movie is shot well, and Michael Myers also looks well in this film. In a franchise where there's constant struggle of getting the mask right, the mask here and Michael Myers' look, it's pretty down pat. There's not a lot of problems with Michael Myers himself. Michael also has some pretty cool kills in it. I mean, he's pretty brutal in this movie. It seems almost that Michael Myers is pretty mad. There's some scenes in part 5 where Michael Myers is stumbling around in the background by a tree. You don't have that here. You know, Michael Myers is constantly in the darkness, he's pursuing people. And when Michael Myers is in scenes, usually there is tension. Now I want to get into some things that I don't really like about this film. One of the major cardinal sins for me. They didn't bring back Danielle Harris. They shortchanged her. Danielle Harris actually really wanted to be in this movie, and they told her, like, okay, fine, but if you're going to work in the next movie, like, you need to be emancipated. Like, you can't work as a minor, it restricts work hours, we can't have that. So Danielle Harris paid for that out of her own pocket so she could be in this movie. And then they come back and they tell her, like, well, your part's going to be really small, so you're just going to get the minimum payment here. So they lowballed her an hour and offended Danielle Harris so much that she turned down the offer. Which I'm glad she did, because if all that they wanted her to do is what her character does in part 6, I mean, it's a waste. I mean, they had a little girl in part 4 and 5 who got thrown around, screamed at the top of her lungs, went through it all. I mean, she was the brand new star besides Jamie Lee Curtis. I mean, she was the next new thing that people liked. And then the franchise just kind of threw her to the side and said, sorry, we don't care. So they replaced Danielle Harris, and they get a brand new actress to play Jamie. And if my voice sounds a little funky, I am just getting over an illness, so I apologize. And my voice kind of cracks in and out. I'm doing my best here. I literally did not have a voice 2 days ago. I'm trying my best to recover, and I wanted to get out an episode, so this is me doing my best. Now, before I get into what they have the character Jamie do in this movie, one thing that always just kind of puzzles me, like, I am a staunch defender for Halloween Part 5. I know it is flawed, but there's a lot of people, they point their fingers at Part 5 because it has the whole Men in Black plot line, and they're like, oh, that's where the franchise went bad. You know, they put in the Men in Black, and they didn't even know what they were going to do with it, and they put it in. So Halloween 5 catches flack for that. But I mean, let's break it down, okay? All that Halloween 5 really did, they put in a little plot line where Michael Myers has this little symbol on his wrist, and they literally have a mysterious figure dressed in black just show up 2 to 3 times in the movie, and then that mysterious figure comes and breaks Michael Myers out of jail. Now, this plot line is not Inception. This is a pretty standard, just, you don't make up something good to fill in for it, to describe the Men in Black. And there's rumors that Quentin Tarantino, he had a whole story about the Man in Black was like Michael Myers' equal, and they have this big showdown in this movie he wanted to make, but it never happened. So instead we get this plot of a movie, which in the writer's defense, this movie has went through several writers, multiple directors, and I believe the label changed halfway through this movie. Halfway through this movie, the Weinsteins came in. And I guess the Weinsteins just tried to control everything. They flipped the story over. After they had shot most of the movie, the Weinsteins were like, we don't want the whole cult plot line in here. Get rid of that. And the people were like, we can't. We shot most of the film. And then there was this big argument between the director and the writer and the label itself and the Weinsteins. And it was just a gigantic mess. This movie was delayed multiple times. Now, what the plot of this movie reminds me of, it strikes me as if someone sat in a room for way too long with way too many people, with way too many ideas, and then just tried to overwrite the crap out of this film. And by the end, it doesn't really make sense, and there's a lot of things you just don't really even care for. I mean, some of these sequels that came before this movie, I think John Carpenter came up with the idea for Halloween 2 in the span of like a couple days. The writer of Halloween 4 wrote his script in a couple of days. They're all very simple stories. And this one is not. There is just way too much going on in this film. And I know I am being really harsh on this film, but man, my whole childhood revolved around Halloween 4 and 5, and then I found out this one existed, got super pumped, and I was like, oh sweet, I'm gonna find out what happens to Jamie. And then when I finally ended up watching this film, I was so devastated at what they gave me. So instead, what I get is the movie opens up with Jamie played by another actress. She's pregnant with Michael Myers' baby. Yes, Michael Myers impregnates his niece because that's supposedly what this cult wanted, the Cult of Thorn, and they are controlling Michael Myers. And Jamie tries to escape. She does for a little bit, which I will say the chase scene does look really cool in that rain. Jamie's just running everywhere. There's a guy who gets out of a truck. He gets killed. The atmosphere is really cool. But just my problem is just, what it opens up with. Like, it's just sad. It's like, ooh, this scene looks cool, but I'm kind of disappointed with where we're going. But then eventually Michael Myers catches up to Jamie, throws her on some farming equipment, it stabs her, she holds out her hands like, help me. And Michael Myers shoves her down even farther, and then turns on the harvester, which just grinds up her organs. I don't even know how to describe it, but brutally kills Jamie. Now let's remind ourselves, what was one of the cardinal sins that Halloween 5 committed? They killed off Rachel way too soon, right? They killed off Rachel 21 minutes in Halloween 4, and people were outraged. Well, Halloween 6 says, hold my beer, we'll kill Jamie even quicker. So then we get this brand new plot, where we have Tommy Doyle, played by Paul Rudd, which is kind of cool. But this is by far one of Paul Rudd's worst performances, in my opinion. He kind of just plays a creep, which I know that was meant to be his character. But man, you never would have guessed, this is movie star Paul Rudd playing this character. Paul Rudd befriends a little boy named Danny, who can hear the voice of the man in black, or the man in darkness, whatever you want to call him. Danny's mom's name is Kara. Kara's friends are Tim and Beth. Tim does the perfect impersonation of Beavis and Butthead at one stage of the movie. Danny has some drawings that are disturbing, and Tim's oh, I like it. And it's what the heck's wrong with this guy? Probably the time this was filmed in. Maybe that was cool back then. I don't know. Then we have Beth, who's Tim's girlfriend. I think I already said that. We have John and Deborah Strode, which they were named in honor of John Carpenter and Deborah, his wife Deborah. But these characters were in an abusive relationship, so it's just kind of weird. Oh, that's who you named them after. But I digress. John plays a very hateable character. He's the abusive dad. He calls Danny a bastard. And when eventually he's killed by Michael Myers. And right before he's killed, he gets home and he's like, where's my dinner? He's all ticked off. But Deborah's long dead by this point. He goes into the basement. Michael Myers kills him. And there was 2 copies of this film. There's the theater cut and the production cut. And one of the cuts literally has his head explode, which is pretty cool. That's the cut they should have stayed with. Speaking of deaths, Deborah, I should have mentioned hers before John, but I'll just get on with Deborah's death too. When Deborah gets home, she literally gets a phone call from the man in black, and he's like, I'm gonna take your kid. And the man in black's literally prank calling people. That's how outrageous this movie gets. But she runs into her house, she sees Michael Myers, and the chase scene's just so dumb and over the top. She goes into her backyard where she has sheets hanging up. And she starts like looking around the sheets and acting like she's lost. Like she is in her own backyard and she looks so puzzled. Then she runs and runs and she starts tripping on the sheets and she's like flailing the sheets down. Like it cracked me up. I was like, what's going on? But eventually Michael Myers is like, all right, I've had enough. And then he kills her. Now, there's a whole lot of other stuff that happens in this movie. A lot of it doesn't really make sense to me. But two things I do kind of want to highlight that were kind of cool. There is the part where Tommy Doyle is walking in the yard, and there's a little girl that goes, it's raining. And she's covered in just red liquid, and it's blood. They really just had like an eerie atmosphere to it. And another thing I could say that's kind of cool is when Michael Myers takes out all the Thorn members that were like in the operating room, which if you look at it and you're like, why are they in lab coats and look like doctors? When in the beginning they had on robes. That's actually the Weinstein's doing. I read a book where the director was talking about it, and they had the whole cult thing like ready to go. But when they were shooting this scene, I guess the Weinsteins like just hated the idea of the cult, even though most of the movie revolved around the cult. And he said that the writer took a phone call from Harvey, and the director approached the writer as he's talking to him, and the writer's like, hey, they want to throw out these cult robes. And the director's like, but that's what the scene revolves around. Like, how are we going to do that? And he said you can literally hear it on the phone. Like, he's 5 feet away from the guy, but he heard Harvey screaming, throw away the fucking robes, like, repeatedly. So they had to deal with that. And I mean, the director at the time, he was a young guy. I mean, if he was older, he probably would have stood up for himself or left the project like a lot of other directors did. But I mean, he wanted to stick with the movie. Like, it's kind of hard to blame him. It's a Halloween film. But what I was getting to is that little scene where he's killing a bunch of different people. We really hadn't seen that in a Halloween movie before. Usually he's stalking, he's going one-on-one, sometimes two-on-one, you know, if Loomis is around. But I mean, he's taking on a whole group of people. And that was kind of cool to see. I mean, the lights were really flashy and stroby. Sometimes that can get a little annoying. But I mean, hey, it's something different. And I mean, it's something I could say like, oh, it was kind of cool in this movie. Let me get back to a pet peeve here. The guy setting up all this evil stuff is Dr. Wynn. Okay, who is Dr. Wynn, you might ask? Yeah, not a lot of people knew the first time watching this. He was literally in one scene before this movie. And they made him the ultimate bad guy. He was the guy who set all this up. It reminds me of the first Friday the 13th when you're like, ooh, who's the killer? And then Pamela just shows up out of nowhere. And she's like, it's me. Remember that story in the first 12 minutes? That's me. Or maybe Friday the 13th Part 5 where you're trying to figure out who's the killer. You think it might be a main character, but nope, it's Roy from the ambulance. That's who Dr. Wynn is in this film. Now you might have noticed I've went this entire review without even mentioning Dr. Loomis. And it's partially because it just saddens me. I feel like the dude deserved more. I feel like the character deserved to go out on a brighter note. I mean, in my heart and in my head, I always just kind of think that Dr. Loomis, his arc truly ends in Part 5. I mean, there's a line of dialogue where Loomis, he's listening to the radio, a caller thinks he's dead, and he just kind of laughs and he's like, oh, not dead, but just retired. And it kind of suits how this whole movie is. It's just unfortunate. I mean, I love Dr. Loomis. The lines he does in this movie are good with his condition. I mean, you can tell he's aged. And I mean, he died in the middle of production. So you can just kind of tell, especially in one of the versions of the cut, they literally trail off with Dr. Loomis staying behind. Tommy Doyle and all of them, they drive off. And then you hear Dr. Loomis screaming, and the movie ends. You don't even see it. And you can just tell that was probably because, you know, he passed away during production, which is very unfortunate. It's just another thing going against this movie. I mean, I feel bad for the director that had to try to organize all of this. You know how there's documentaries where, like, production just becomes a disaster, and, like, when you watch the documentary, it's more entertaining than the movie itself because you just didn't know of all the things that went on behind the scenes. I really wish I could watch one over this movie because it just seems like a lot went on, and it is very unfortunate with how it was handled. Because, I mean, like I said before, with how well it's shot and how well Michael looked, it's clear some people cared. But it just seemed like the writing just went over the top and too many things were at odds against each other. Now, before I go, let me come back around one more time and kind of give a defense for Halloween 5 into how Halloween 6 handled the Man in Black and the Cult of Thorn plot. Going back to Halloween 5, when Michael Myers is river rafting and he washes up ashore after he's defeated in Halloween 4, and the guy kind of like nurses him back to health. I believe there's actually a deleted scene to where that guy was actually supposed to be like a cult member or some voodoo guy. And how he brings Michael back is he performs like this dark magic, which of course is cut when the movie is finally released. But if they would have kept that, that would have made a lot more sense leading into part 6. And let's look back to Halloween part 4, when Loomis jumps into the truck and there's that crazy reverend guy and he's talking about how he's driving to the ultimate evil, and Dr. Loomis kind of like meets his equal in terms of hunting down evil. I mean, that dude could have been part of the plot of Halloween 6. The thing that other reverend was hunting could have been the Man in Black. They could have done a whole lot of things that pulled back into 4 and 5 that just made it make a lot more sense. Michael Myers trying to impregnate Jamie does not make sense. There's several scenes in 4 and 5 where Michael Myers is clearly trying to kill Jamie. So if the Cult of Thorn is telling him, hey, you need to impregnate your niece, trying to stab her through the vent is probably not a good way of doing it. I mean, if he would have killed her, what was he going to do? Like, whoops, like, messed that one up. Sorry, Cult of Thorn. Like, it just doesn't make sense at all. And it feels like it doesn't tie well into 4 and 5 either. It's just, again, disappointing for me. And if you argue, well, in part 5, they shouldn't have set forth plot lines that they didn't know where they were going. They shouldn't have had an idea of where they were going. Let's keep in mind George Lucas also did this with the OG Star Wars series. And the prequels, which I know he messed those up. But I mean, the OG ones, he did that also. He said he had a plan. He never really had a plan. He just put these little plot lines forward and dealt with them as he went. So, I mean, it's kind of a common thread. A lot of directors don't know if they're getting another movie. So they sometimes insert things that increase interest so that hopefully they do get that next movie. Okay, I'll quit defending Halloween 5 now. If you do like this movie, which there are a lot of people that do. They like the atmosphere of it, and they think it's a really cool movie, and that is awesome. I know I downed it a lot in this review, and I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but I just really struggle with this movie of trying to speak positively about it. But yeah, I mean, we all have our opinions, so, if I'm crapping on your favorite movie, I'm sorry. We all have our different opinions, yours is just as good as mine. In fact, if you disagree with me, feel free to comment on this episode and tell me what you think, because, I mean, when people defend this movie, I do like hearing different perspectives and points of view, and maybe I'm off at certain points, and maybe I'm right. If you agree, tell me that too. You'll make me feel a little better. Again, as we go, feel free to like this episode. It always helps the channel when you give it a nice little like, and I appreciate that. I am covering all of the Halloween movies, so if you are into the Halloween franchise, hit that little bell and subscribe so that you know when the next one comes out. And I also have a review of The First Omen coming up, so I mean, that's kind of exciting stuff too. So, again, if you're still listening, thanks again for listening, and until next time, guys.